September 1529. On the plains east of the Danube, a column stretches beyond the horizon. 120,000 men, a wall of cavalry, siege guns, and camel trains, grinding westward through mud and rain toward a single-walled city. At its head rides Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, ruler of 3 continents, a man who has never lost a siege he chose to finish. His target is Vienna, the last major stronghold standing between the Ottoman war machine and the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. If Vienna falls, the road to Germany lies open. What happens in the next 3 weeks will decide whether Central Europe remains Christian or becomes Ottoman, whether the Habsburg dynasty survives, whether the balance of the entire continent tips east. This is the story of the siege that stopped an empire at its peak. To understand why Suleiman's army is marching on Vienna, you have to go back 3 years, to a battlefield in Hungary. In August 1526, at Mohacs, the Ottomans shattered the Kingdom of Hungary in a single afternoon. King Louis II drowned fleeing the field. His army was annihilated. Hungary, once a buffer state protecting Central Europe, collapsed almost overnight. Into the vacuum stepped 2 rival claimants. Ferdinand of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, and brother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, claimed the Hungarian crown through marriage. But a Hungarian nobleman, John Zapolya, also claimed the throne, and turned to Suleiman for protection. Suleiman recognized Zapolya as a vassal king. Ferdinand refused to accept it. By 1527, Ferdinand's forces had seized Buda, driving Zapolya out. Suleiman would not tolerate the insult. An Ottoman client had been humiliated by a Habsburg archduke. In the logic of an empire that had never stopped expanding for 2 centuries, there was only one answer: war. On one side, Suleiman the Magnificent, at the height of his power, commanding the most feared military machine in the world, Janissary infantry, Sipahi cavalry, and an artillery train hauled across 1,000 miles of hostile terrain. Beside him, his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly loyal to the Sultan's vision of a Europe under Ottoman order. On the other side, a city with almost no army of its own. Archduke Ferdinand had already fled to Bohemia to raise reinforcements, leaving Vienna's defense to a 70-year-old German mercenary commander, Nicholas Graf Salm, a veteran of the brutal Italian wars, recalled from retirement for one final command. Salm had roughly 16 to 20,000 men, Landsknecht pikemen, Spanish arquebusiers, German and Bohemian militia, against an army that outnumbered them 6, possibly 7 to 1. The odds were not close, and everyone inside those walls knew it. Suleiman's campaign had begun in May 1529, from Constantinople, with a force historians estimate between 120,000 and 150,000 men. Some accounts push higher. But the situation was about to get worse for the Ottomans, before it got worse for Vienna. The spring rains of 1529 were catastrophic. The Balkan roads dissolved into swamp. Rivers swelled and swallowed bridges. Heavy siege cannons, the guns that had smashed the walls of Rhodes and Belgrade, sank into the mud and had to be abandoned along the march. Thousands of camels, the backbone of Ottoman logistics, died from exhaustion and disease. Suleiman's army reached Vienna in late September, weeks later than planned, and without the heavy artillery that had guaranteed victory in every siege before this one. Inside Vienna, Salm had used every one of those delayed weeks. He demolished suburban buildings outside the walls to deny the enemy cover. He reinforced the aging medieval fortifications with earthen bastions and timber palisades. He sealed gates, stockpiled grain, and dug in for a fight he did not expect to win easily, if at all. On September 27, 1529, Ottoman forces surrounded Vienna completely, cutting the city off from relief. Without heavy siege guns capable of breaching stone walls from a distance, Suleiman's engineers turned to an older, more brutal method: mining. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels beneath Vienna's walls, packing them with gunpowder, attempting to blow breaches directly into the city's defenses. Salm's men countermined, digging their own tunnels to intercept and destroy Ottoman charges before they could detonate. Underground, in absolute darkness, men fought with knives and short blades in tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. a war beneath the war that most histories barely mention, and one of the most terrifying forms of combat in the early modern world. Above ground, Janissary assault waves stormed the walls again and again, only to be repelled by pikemen and gunners at point-blank range. This victory at each breach would not last. The Ottomans regrouped, remined, and came again and again. By early October, conditions on both sides had turned brutal. Inside the city, disease spread through cramped quarters. Food supplies thinned. Civilians manned the walls alongside soldiers. Salm himself, despite his age, refused to leave the ramparts. Outside, the Ottoman army faced an enemy more relentless than Habsburg pikemen, the Central European winter, arriving early and hard. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles from Constantinople were failing. Forage for horses and camels was running out. Disease moved through the camps. The Sultan's council knew the numbers. Every week outside Vienna's walls without a breakthrough was a week closer to disaster. An army of this size could not winter in hostile territory this far from home. The enemy was already moving toward a decision that would define the entire campaign. On October 11th and 12th, Suleiman ordered the largest mine detonations of the siege, blasting significant breaches into Vienna's walls near the Kärntner Gate. Janissary shock troops poured through the gaps in what was meant to be the decisive, war-ending assault. What followed would decide the fate of Central Europe. Salm's defenders met them in the breach itself, pikes locked, arquebus fire tearing into the packed Ottoman ranks at point-blank range, hand-to-hand fighting in the rubble of the shattered wall. The Janissaries, some of the finest infantry on earth, could not hold the breach. Wave after wave was thrown back. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, simply refused to break. By nightfall on October 12th, the last major Ottoman assault had failed. Suleiman convened his commanders. The verdict was unanimous and grim. No heavy artillery, dwindling supplies, a winter closing in, and a defense that would not collapse. On the night of October 14, 1529, the Ottoman army began its withdrawal, but not before a final, savage gesture. Retreating columns burned the countryside around Vienna and reportedly executed a large number of the prisoners taken during the campaign, a brutal final act meant to punish a city the Sultan could not conquer. By October 15th, the siege was over. Suleiman's army, the largest force he would ever personally lead into Central Europe, turned back toward Constantinople, hungry, diminished, and defeated not by a bigger army, but by mud, mines, and a wall of pikes that would not move. The siege of Vienna did not destroy the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman would return in 1532 with another army, and Ottoman-Habsburg wars would continue for generations. Hungary itself remained divided and contested for over a century. But 1529 marked something the Ottomans had not encountered in 200 years of continuous expansion, a hard limit. Vienna became the symbolic high-water mark of Ottoman power in Europe. Never again would a sultan personally lead an army this deep into the Holy Roman Empire, with a realistic hope of taking its capital. The city that endured 16 days of mining, assault, and starvation had done what field armies at Mohacs could not. It held the line. For the Habsburgs, the siege cemented Vienna's identity as the shield of Central Europe, a role the city would be forced to play again in 1683, when another Ottoman army marched on its walls. For Suleiman, despite the failure, the empire he ruled remained the most powerful military force on earth for another century. But the myth of Ottoman invincibility in Central Europe had been broken, in the mud outside a half-ruined medieval wall, by a garrison that was never supposed to survive. 16,000 defenders, a 70-year-old commander pulled from retirement, walls patched together with rubble and timber, against one of the largest armies the 16th century had ever seen. Vienna should have fallen. By every measure of numbers, artillery, and momentum, it should have fallen. It did not. And in that failure, in the mud and the mines and the breach at the Kärntner Gate, the outer limit of Ottoman expansion into Europe was drawn, a line that would hold in one form or another for the next century and a half. If you want to understand how empires reach their peak and the exact moment they discover they are not unstoppable, subscribe, because that is the story this channel exists to tell.